So my thanks go back to the organizers, who invited me, the Institute for Jewish Studies, of course, with Jan Lorenz, who organized this, and the Kazerne Dossin with Berle, who is I would say, even an old colleague of mine, and I hope to continue based on the decisions of the European Commissions, whether we still get funding. Yes, I choose this title a little bit randomly, actually, to make my presentation a bit more attractive than to speak about the development and state of Holocaust research in general. So I was addressed by Vivian whether this was meant in a more philosophical way, so I have to disappoint you, since this is purely historiographical in a more traditional sense, as you will soon see. I will speak in the next 45-50 minutes about two subjects. One is a little bit shorter one on the development of the knowledge on the Holocaust since the war, and the other addresses the, I would say, important questions of Holocaust research, of Holocaust knowledge, which occurred, of course. This sounds a little bit like a crash course in Holocaust history. Most of you have already broader experience with presentations or research on Holocaust history, so probably most of it or a lot of it will not be new to you. The knowledge about the Holocaust started to emerge right after the beginning of the Holocaust itself, I would say after the beginning of systematic mass murder in summer 1941, especially concerning the mass executions in the occupied Soviet Union. The first informations, official informations about these were the so-called Molotov notes. These were issued by the Soviet Foreign Ministry, that's why they are called Molotov notes, starting in August 1941. And the knowledge on the mass executions and the killings in the so-called gas vans in the occupied Soviet Union soon started to spread through German soldiers who wrote field letters about that or were on leave, for example, during Christmas 1941 or a little bit later. I think in autumn 1942 there was widespread knowledge of the extermination of European Jews, both in the realm of the Allies and of the Axis. It was first and foremost the Polish underground movement. I would say both the Polish, ethnic Polish underground movement and the Jewish underground movement in Poland, which reported and spread these information to the Polish government in exile in London. Another channel were the neutral states, especially Switzerland, Swiss diplomacy, but also Swiss intelligence was very well aware of what was going on in the East, and the same can be said for Swedish authorities. Already by 1943, early 1944, some fragmentary information on the extermination camps became known again, in the first place through the Polish underground and through some escapees, most important, of course, Wrba and Wetzlar, who gave detailed accounts about the extermination facilities in Auschwitz-Birkenau. And of course, in summer 1944, the eastern half of Poland was liberated from German occupation by the Red Army. I deliberately say liberated from German rule, because the liberation term is now only rarely applied in Polish public sphere for the events in 1944. The Poles now predominantly consider that as a second occupation, but if you restrict it to this term of liberation from German rule, I think it's okay with them. All of this knowledge was, however, highly fragmentary, and it was often considered as unreliable. Especially among the Western Allies, there was still the memory of atrocity campaigning from the First World War, with its false accusations, and those undermined the credibility of the new, even worse accusations which came into the Foreign Office in London, where you can clearly see that, and was critically received as unbelievable or whatever. Nevertheless, it's reasonable to state that already in 1943, based on this information, the first efforts for Holocaust studies began. There were several important books published in 1943. One of them was the so-called Black Book of Polish Jews, which was issued by the American Jewish Institute in 1943, and gives already detailed insight, for example, on Treblinka extermination camp at a point where nobody else was able to publish about that. So there were other books also related to this institute, and I think this is the beginning of Holocaust research. Of course, the situation changed completely after the German defeat in 1945. Now the survivors could speak out. National commissions were set up who investigated not only the crimes but also the damage inflicted on their countries, and there were Jewish institutions set up. One of the first one was the Centre de Documentation Juive Contemporaine in Paris, which was already founded in the underground in Grenoble in 1943, also with the task to document this. Actually, the first, I would say, organization which collected evidence on the persecution of Jews has been overlooked for a long time. It was in Vilnius in 1939, that means before Soviet occupation, where already Polish Jews collected material on the persecutions, not yet on the mass murder at that point. And later on, and much more famous, is the Warsaw Underground Archive, the Onek Shabbat archive of the group around Emanuel Ringelblum. However, these efforts could spread information only to a limited extent, and nearly all of the members of both committees were killed during the war. From the date of liberation on, that means in the Soviet Union already in early 1943, commissions started to interview witnesses to look for execution places, even unearth mass graves. And with the German defeat in 1945, vast fragments of the German and Axis documentation became available, though the majority of the documents related directly to killing. For each major killing operation, there was an order prior to that, and there was a report after that. That documentation has been almost completely destroyed. We have only tiny fragments, less than 1% of those. But the other documents became available to these investigation commissions and to prosecutors. Both the Nuremberg trials and the national trials all over Europe, amongst others in Belgium, gave a certain access to this documentation. In the Soviet Union, however, most of it was kept secret until 1990. Most important, especially also due to the lack of written documentation, were the witness interviews, which were undertaken both by prosecutors and by Jewish institutions already directly after liberation, beginning in 1943 in the Soviet Union, 1944 in Poland. The most important of these collections were put together in Poland, in Hungary, and in Romania, and each of them contains several thousand witness statements. So we already have, let's say in 1947, at least 20,000 witness statements or written statements of Jews, enormous wealth of information very close to the events, but also by witnesses which were highly traumatized. This has been discussed in several occasions. Already in 1945, the first publications on the Holocaust were available in Europe, especially in Poland, Hungary, and in Western Europe, but also, for example, in displaced person camps on German soil. There were in Bavaria, where I come from, There were several displaced person camps with Jewish survivors from Poland, and they issued a Yiddish journal, Von letzten Kurban, it was called, and it contains very valuable articles. And the interesting thing is they didn't have Yiddish letters at the time, so they had to use Latin letters to publish that, and it's easy for me, of course, to read that without a specific knowledge of the Yiddish language. Rich information was also available in the press, which covered the Nazi crimes trials, and Jewish historians started to collect and to analyze the material. Some researchers, like for example Philipp Friedman, you see him here on bottom left, already in the late 1940s set up big research program. It goes 10, 20 pages, what kind of problems should be investigated. And if you look at in retrospective, it's quite modern. That's in a certain sense also the questions which we are still dealing with that. Of course, at that time, only very few historians or interested persons read that. Despite the material difficulties of the early post-war period and the lack of systematic access to information, long before the age of the internet, there was already European-wide cooperation of these commissions. In 1949, there was the first biggest Holocaust conference in Paris, which was also the last one for decades before the Cold War covered everything. So during the first years after the war, an enormous amount of information was available, though dispersed among different places and languages. And even the first comprehensive overviews were published, like the ones by Leon Polyakov, Brevière de la Haine, was the first, I think, in 1951, and later on by Gerald Reitlinger, who was an Orientalist, not a historian by profession, but he wrote a fundamental history of the Holocaust, published in 1953, and in Poland, a book by Arthur Eisenbach, which was paid tribute to Marxist gods like Lenin at that time, or had to pay tribute, was published. Nevertheless, the interest both in German crimes or in occupation and especially in the Holocaust heavily declined during the late 1940s and early 1950s. The reasons were manifold. I see four of the major reasons. One is the integration of the perpetrators, but also the collaborators into society. So all this collaboration on the Nazi crimes trial more or less ceased around 1947, 48, 49, and were almost dead by 1950. This also applies to the collaboration trials. Most of them were stopped in the late 1940s. The second reason was probably the general mood to forget the war and to re-establish normal life, probably both on the side of the average Europeans and the survivors of the Holocaust. Like Tom Segev's study also shows that the interest in the Holocaust in Israel during the 1950s was actually limited. On the other hand, the survivors were not only in Israel, but they were scattered to immigration countries all over the world. The third and very important factor for Eastern Europe, which were unfortunately the crimes with the most victims and the crime scenes of the Holocaust, was of course the establishment of Stalinism in 1947, 1948, which ended more or less all public debates, and with the anti-Semitic campaigns of late Stalinism or memory of the Holocaust. I have to add that under Stalinism also all war memory ceased to be present in the public sphere. For example, the celebration for 8th and 9th of May, which we know today, we will next year experience probably the biggest parades in Moscow and Beijing, I'm sure about that. But this was stopped in 1948, and the 8th and 9th of May were only re-established in 1965. So there is a real break in war memory which not only affects the Holocaust. And the final factor was, of course, the emerging Cold War, the drive of both East and West to integrate the Germans on their side, the Western Germans into the NATO, and the Western Union, and the Eastern Germans into the Soviet bloc. In effect, both the collection of Holocaust-related documentation and the efforts to publish something were quite limited during the 1950s. And I would argue that there even occurred a loss of knowledge after 1949. For example, some of the most important documents on the Holocaust were published already in 1948, 1949, were completely forgotten and rediscovered then during the 1990s. So we have a loss of knowledge on the Holocaust, at least in the public sphere, probably not among the perpetrators and the survivors. There were, however, some isolated exceptions to this rule. The most important is, of course, the establishment of Yad Vashem Memorial Institution in 1953, and in the immigration countries, Jewish exile groups were set up to commemorate their communities, especially in Poland, the so-called Landsmannschaften, which published Yitzchok books. If you can read them, very impressive. The New York Public Library has them almost completely digitized. I think 400 of the 600 are you can read on their homepage. Of course, most of it is in Yiddish and Hebrew, but there are also parts in English. After less than a decade, around 1957, war memory resurfaced, first in the West, then in the East, and with it, to a certain extent, the interest in the Holocaust. This was triggered by and large, of course, by the trial or the arrest and trial of Adolf Eichmann in Israel. Now, during the 1960s, the Nazi period in general came into focus with the establishment of the German Zeitgeschichte and the vibrant research on Nazism in the West, in the US, and in the United Kingdom, and even historiography in Eastern Europe started to work on the occupation, though not much about the Holocaust. The Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw published very important articles already during the 1950s. I can say the predecessor of my dissertation was published in Poland even in 1952, which contained at least factual material which I covered more or less in the 1990s, then later on. But there were still survivors and other Jewish historians who collected Holocaust-related documentation and investigated the field. The most important of them, of course, is Raoul Hilberg, who finished his dissertation during the 50s and had big problems finding a publisher in the United States, and published his groundbreaking book with very few copies in 1961, and the German translation took another 35 years, so nobody wanted to have it. And we know now the background stories that German historians even intervened not to have this book translated into German. It's not good historiography. If you see the book, it's outstanding. Still today, it's one of the most important achievements of Holocaust research that exists. If we look at the 60s, the Six-Day War of 1967 also had a profound effect on Holocaust awareness, especially among the US Jewish communities. The term Holocaust, for example, was entered into the system of the Library of Congress in 1969, which also signifies a certain awareness, and the term was now in use, at least in the US, to a certain extent also in France. Around that time also the debates on collaboration in Western Europe started, especially in France. I don't know when the beginnings were in Belgium, but in France there was a film, Le Chagrin et la Pitié, Beowulf's, and then a young Canadian historian who wrote about the collaboration, but they didn't show him the files. Robert Paxton opened the discussion in 1973, but this, at that point, did not relate a lot to the Holocaust. This was only a side field. In Eastern Europe, however, at the same time, research was on the decline, because after the Six-Day War, as an anti-Semitic campaign swept through communist Eastern Europe, in first place through Poland, and ended more or less all critical Holocaust research until then most of the historians emigrated to Israel or other countries. The major change then occurred at the end of the 1970s, triggered in first place by the fictional US TV series which introduced the term Holocaust as we use it today. So I would say on a broader basis, this is the effect of this, I would say as an historian, not very good, not very well made series, but nevertheless the impact, for example, in Germany was enormous. But it also was due to a generational change and the willingness to perceive the own history more critical, more self-critical. It is important to underline that the change towards the scientific interest in the Holocaust came not from a research community, but came from society. It was a societal impulse. Why don't we know about this? What have the historians done? Have the historians failed? Was some of the headlines of the 1979 debate. In the following, especially the fate of Jewish communities at home, let's say in your hometown, like some kind of Heimatgeschichte came into focus, and often some kind of grassroots research was applied to interview survivors or family members or other witnesses. On the other hand, this break of end of 1970s, early 1980s led to the gradual establishment of modern Holocaust research, now distinct from both contemporary history on the one side and Jewish studies on the other side, and like all professionalization, this was connected to set up institutions, organizations, and publication series. Beyond this change of ramifications during the 1980s, the fall of communism in Eastern Europe in 1919, of course, had a significant impact on the knowledge of Holocaust. There were some efforts by communist governments to memorialize the Holocaust already during the 1980s. This had to do with foreign policy interests, especially coming in contact with the US. There it was very important. But of course, a major change came in 1919 with the opening of the Eastern European archives and a new wave of survivor interviews, especially in the Soviet Union. In the Soviet Union between 1948 and 1990, almost no survivor was interviewed. So there's a big loss of knowledge here because lots of them died. Of course, there was some exceptional cases of emigres who left the Soviet Union after 1971, the first emigration wave, and were interviewed in Israel, for example. And it was now possible to publish about the Holocaust in Eastern Europe without censorship. Today, I would say it's reasonable to state that the Holocaust is probably the best known event in history, not only related to its worldwide memorialization, but also to the extent of research and documentation in the area is one part of it. I always say in this, on these kinds of presentations, look to the library of Yad Vashem online. It has currently 132,000 entries, which are more or less Holocaust related, not only books, but also articles. This gives you a hint of the amount of research and knowledge that's more than has been published on the First World War, for example. The Holocaust is probably the only event in history where research tries to establish virtually every detail, every biography of victims or perpetrators, every place, and to look for every document. Due to the specific structure of the efforts to reconstruct the Holocaust, I would argue it's not only Holocaust research or Holocaust studies, but it's Holocaust knowledge, which goes beyond research. It's a combined effort not only of the scientific community, but also by survivors, amateur researchers, especially on the local level, others like journalists, civil society activists, and so on. Today it's virtually impossible to summarize these efforts, and there are, however, important historiographical syntheses like the ones by Raoul Hilberg. Lenia Hill has to be mentioned, Charles Friedländer with his important book, and recently Christian Gerlach with his analytical history of the Holocaust, which is hard to read but summarizes, like no other book, the current state of historiography. In a second step, I now try to outline some major themes in the Holocaust history and address a little bit what we know and where knowledge is insufficient or interpretations are highly debated. Of course, I cannot give you an exhaustive overview on all the perspectives of the Holocaust. I rather address some fields which played a major role in historiography during the last 3 decades, like, as you see here, the radicalization into mass murder, the structure of the perpetrators, the role of non-Jewish societies, majorities, a little bit the reaction of Jewish communities, and the international setting. The first and foremost question which drives not only research but also public interest concerns, of course, the origins, or to be more imprecise, the causes of the Holocaust. Timothy Snyder was the only one who dared to write an article called The Causes of the Holocaust, and I was quite astounded when I read it. I think it is very difficult to speak about the causes of the Holocaust. The Holocaust can be explained by its origins, and this is a debate which goes beyond historiographical concepts. This is also a historiographical, philosophical concept, and since we live in a period of postmodernism, or I would even say post-postmodernism right now, I hope so at least, it's the question whether the Holocaust can be explained or not. Is the concept of causality a useful one or not, or do we have an unstructured process of radicalization in history? For decades, the origins of the Holocaust seems clearly identifiable. You can read that in books in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. The classical narrative started with the transformation of German, in brackets, and Austrian anti-Semitism since the 1870s, a transformation which was predominantly directed against the emancipation of Jews, which occurred in the 19th century, and turned into a racist exclusion of all persons with alleged Jewish blood, thus including also those with Jewish ancestry who had converted to Christianity. And the narrative goes on. It was Hitler and the Nazi Party which radicalized this anti-Semitism in a political program, which was then executed, unfolded, or how you call it, from 1933 on. This classical narrative has been challenged during the last 2 or 3 decades. The traditional view of both a specific German anti-Semitism and the continuity of that new anti-Semitism, as it has been claimed from the turn of the century to 1933, is now under discussion. Though the core of anti-Semitism was biological thinking, the majority of Germans and German perpetrators, and also other Europeans, were still by and large influenced by the cultural, religious discourses on the Jews. For example, the typical one which hasn't been investigated is Jewish gold. The Jews must have some hidden gold. You see this until the mass executions that Polish farmers are digging up graves and so on and looking for this gold, which is, of course, has nothing to do with biological anti-Semitism, though they were also not important perpetrators. Nazi anti-Semitism, on the other hand, is now considered as more different from the European anti-Semitism, especially Charles Friedländer has called it a redemptive anti-Semitism. At the core of their worldview, in a literal sense, it is the alleged solution not only to the problems of German society, which older anti-Semites, older anti-Semites perceived it, but to solve all global problems. Nevertheless, despite intensive research on anti-Semitism, there are still astounding blank spots. For example, a comparative perspective on all of European anti-Semitisms after 1918 is still missing, and the extremely violent period of the post-First World War, 1918 to 1921, with mass murder in Hungary or Ukraine, mass murder of Jews, of course, has not acquired the attention it deserves as some kind of a forerunner, especially in those two countries. In Hungary, we have even perpetrators who were active in 1919 and in 1944. So there is a certain continuity, though the crimes in 1919, of course, were of different dimension. Even more striking is that we almost have no studies on Nazi anti-Semitism itself, including the years after 1933. Even the anti-Semitic propaganda has not yet been investigated in depth. There's only 1 or 2 books on that. So Nazi anti-Semitism is considered as self-explaining. I mean, they just hated the Jews, but that's not enough for analysis, because there was no unified concept of Nazi anti-Semitism. For example, until 1943, 1934, it was unclear among the Nazi leadership who was to be considered a Jew and who not. Some proponents even argued that every person with a Jewish ancestor allegedly had a drop of Jewish blood in his veins and is of Jewish origins. But Hitler clearly saw that would lead to the discrimination of, let's say, 10 or 20% of the German population, because this was widespread. So it was decided to rely upon religion. You might know, according to the Nuremberg law, you needed 3 grandparents to be considered as a full Jew. 3 Jewish grandparents to be considered as a full Jew. So the biological proponents use religion to define their victims. From an ideological perspective, it is also unclear why the major victims of the Holocaust were the Polish Jews, who were neither capitalist Western Jews nor Bolshevik Kremlin Jews. So it's still explainable what did the Polish Jews mean for the Nazis in a certain sense, or were there other factors than anti-Semitism? Anti-Semitism is now considered only as a basis, but not as a sufficient condition for mass murder. Other factors came into discussion, like the demoralization of societies already after the First World War, but especially after 1933 in Germany and then in other countries. The broad acceptance of violence against alleged enemies, which was different from the pre-First World War period, and the retreat of the law-abiding state, or the transformation of the political process in Nazi Germany, were a kind of structural Darwinism, weakened formal procedures and favored the most radical views. The merger of the Nazi Party and its organizations like the SS with state institutions like the police created new forms of statehood. Neue Staatlichkeit is that in the German discussion. And finally, the most important feature of Nazism, which laid the basis for systematic mass murder, was the German war and Nazi imperialism. So I would argue, though that's counterfactual, without the war, no Holocaust. If we look at the radicalization into genocide, there were 3 phases of radicalization. First, the consolidation of the Nazi regime between 1933 and 1937, both by establishing a dictatorship and by finding broad support among the German population. The 2 major reasons for the latter fact were the decline of unemployment and the Nazi success in demolishing the post-First War order, to name Versailles, which made Hitler and the regime so popular, and at the other side hastened the acceptance of anti-Jewish policies. The anti-Jewish persecution during the 1930s revoked step by step the process of emancipation of German Jews and excluded them from the so-called racial national community, the Volksgemeinschaft. On the one hand, the state leadership enacted its anti-Jewish decrees. On the other hand, local Nazi activists terrorized the Jews, and they more or less both played the same game. So the leadership waited for some initiative from below to proceed with the anti-Jewish law. That's quite visible, for example, with the Nuremberg laws. This was not only coming from above. The second phase of radicalizations came in 1937, 1938. Now big concentration camps were set up, not only for political enemies, but also for allegedly racial enemies. For example, so-called asocial, Sinti and Roma, but also Jews who were criminalized came into the concentration camps from that. The concentration camps themselves created an extra legal zone within Germany, and in a certain sense became the forerunner to the spaces of violence which were created during the war, especially in Poland, in Yugoslavia, and in the Soviet Union. And the new concentration camps from 1937, 1938 on, like Buchenwald, Mauthausen, for example, were deliberately established as a means to prepare the war, as the internal side of the war, to arrest everybody who is considered an opponent in case of war. And the persecution of Jews was more and more connected to Nazi foreign policy. The annexation of Austria in March 1938 led to an unprecedented degree of violence against the Jews, including already forced mass expulsions. This pattern was repeated during the annexation of the Sudetenland, which was Western Bohemia, in October 1938. And even the pogrom of November 1938 was closely related to the outside world. The main purpose of the pogrom, the main motive of the Nazi leadership, was to terrorize the Jews within Germany and Austria in order to accelerate emigration, which had slowed down. And this worked in a very violent way. During the pogrom, approximately 1,000 Jews died. Most of them were killed within concentration camps, lots of them committed suicide. Probably the most important radicalization came, however, with the German attack on Poland. The German invaders now radicalized their anti-Semitism against Polish Jewry, which was considered as even worse, as uncivilized, and as a social problem of a major dimension. And the German military campaign was accompanied by the first mass murders in Nazi history. Prior to that, there were individual murders. Approximately 10,000 persons were killed up to the beginning of the war. Now, mass murders started. In first place, against Polish POWs, against civilian hostages, and after some weeks, against the Polish intelligentsia, that means the upper strata of this Polish society. According to Polish historiography, around 60,000 Poles were shot at the turn of 1939, 1940. At the same time, the mass murder of the mentally ill began, also first in Poland, then in Germany and in Austria proper. Even the infamous disinfectant Zyklon B was apparently used for the first time on inmates of Polish psychiatric institutions in early 1940, long before Auschwitz. With the occupation of Poland, the first large-scale demographic projects for Poles and Jews were set up, and the latter ones were already called Solution of the Jewish Question. At the end of 1939, the deportation of millions of Poles and Jews from the annexed territories of Western Poland was envisaged, then of course not to extermination centers, but to other parts of Poland. And as we know now, even there was an offer to the Soviet Union to take its Jews, but the Soviet government declined and didn't even answer that request. At the end of 1939, approximately the deportation of approximately 400,000 Poles in the majority and some Jews started, and in the end only 10% of these deportation schemes were realized. But they set the precedence for what was to come in 1941, 1942. deportations of hundreds of thousands, mass executions, killing by gas. All of this was German practice already in 1940. Holocaust historiography, however, has focused for a long time on the period of systematic mass extermination. Later, from summer 1941 on, and only to a limited extent to what I would call predecessor murders and their effects on German planning and German practice. The extremely important case of Poland also shows the limited relevance of anti-communism for the onset of mass murder, which has always been emphasized, of course, in connection to the war against the Soviet Union. Most Poles, however, were considered as anti-Bolsheviks, but their elites were killed nevertheless. In a certain sense, the violence during the short German campaign in Poland, which lasted 3.5 or 4 weeks, showed nearly all features which repeated during the first 2 months of the war against the Soviet Union 1.5 years later. Nevertheless, there can be no doubt that the systematic killing of European Jews started, I say systematic killing of European Jews, started during the German attack on the Soviet Union in June 1941. The escalation into wholesale mass killing has been investigated in depth during the last 3 decades. And 3 steps were identified. First, the killing of able-bodied Jewish men of military age during the roughly first 2 months of the campaign. Then between August and October 1941, the individual units started to extend the killing to Jewish women and children. And finally, from late September on, the Jewish communities which newly came under occupation, the Jewish communities in the East, were completely exterminated right after occupation, like is visible in the Babi Yar massacre in Kiev. What has been omitted for a long time was the extermination campaign of the Romanian forces, at that time allies of the Germans during the war against the Soviet Union. Romanian military and police forces exterminated whole Jewish communities in Bessarabia even before the Germans did so, already by July 1941. And there are indications that the biggest massacre of the Holocaust was not in Babi Yar and Kiev, but the Romanian killings in occupied Odessa in October 1941. This case, unfortunately, has not been fully investigated yet. I think the case of Romania is also in so far very important because it sheds light on all the analysis of radicalization processes preceding the Holocaust. The Romanian leader Ion Antonescu neither needed a long-established totalitarian dictatorship nor the cooperation with local fascists to commit mass murder. He even suppressed the fascists in Romania. But the killings of the German mobile SS and police units, in first place the Einsatzgruppen and the battalions of the Order Police, received much historiographical attention. The ghettos inside the occupied Soviet territory, in the majority of mass murder operations in these areas, which occurred later in 1942-43, did not. These were not mobile units like the Einsatzgruppen, but a stable structure of the security police and the security service of the SS, which until now is partially unexplored. The same applies to the ghettos, especially those which were on the territory of the Soviet Union before the annexations in 1939-1940. I mean the ghettos on the territory. They existed, of course, later on. Sources, especially for the Ukraine and the Russian Federation, are very scarce until today. With the massacre of Babi Yar at the end of September, the core phase of the Holocaust began. There has been an extensive debate on the question whether Hitler gave a single order to murder all European Jews, and if so, when did he do so? To a certain degree, a consensus evolved among historians that the project to murder all European Jews developed between spring 1941 and spring 1942 in a discussion between several institutions of the Nazi state, not only in the center, but also between the center in Berlin and the periphery in the occupied territories. So there were lots of initiatives coming from everywhere, from Paris, Lublin, Poznan, for example, to name among them a few. Hitler's role and Hitler's intervention was, of course, structurally necessary for this process. And probably the most important of these interventions came in September, October 1941. In December 1941, this is still under debate. In late September, early October 1941, the Holocaust had already reached full dimensions within the Soviet-occupied territories. At the same time, the German military started to murder Serbian Jews, and in occupied Poland, the establishment of extermination camps was prepared. In late 1941, early 1942, these camps went into operation. From now on, the Jews from the German Reich in Slovakia were included in the extermination program. Auschwitz, which was meant as a concentration camp for Poles and not for Jews, was transformed in late 1941, early 1942 into an extermination center. And in July 1942, the large-scale deportations from Western Europe, including Belgium, to this destination started. Between July and November 1942 occurred the most killings of the Holocaust, probably the most killings in world history. Around 2 million human beings were murdered within 3.5 months. Sometimes you can read in the press, no, that was Rwanda, so the fastest genocide. That's not the case. It's the Holocaust in the late summer, early autumn 1942. The core phase of the Holocaust then ended approximately in August, September 1943. Most Jews under occupation in Poland and the Soviet Union from Yugoslavia and Greece had been killed. Only the communities in Hungary and Italy came later into German reach. After the German occupation of Hungary and its annexed territories in March 1944, another 500,000 persons lost their lives. The last chapter of the Holocaust, however, started in the summer of 1944 with the German retreat from the east and the evacuation of the camps. Jewish forced laborers made up the majority of those who died during the last months, especially during the so-called death marches. Our knowledge of these crimes is quite uneven. The fate of Jewish communities in Western and in Central Europe, in Italy and in Hungary has been reconstructed in detail. Nearly all the victims have been identified, at least by name. But the overall majority of victims from Eastern Europe have not yet been identified, especially those from Poland, the Soviet Union within its old borders, and from Romania. Even the fate of some smaller Jewish communities is virtually unknown if they do not show up in documents or in witness statements. Unfortunately, only at a very late stage, non-Jewish witnesses were interviewed on the Holocaust, those who could give evidence on the fate of their Jewish neighbors. There is, however, also no comprehensive knowledge on the perpetrators, even not the German ones. My rough estimate on the number of those Germans and Austrians who participated in one way or another in deportations and killings runs up to 200,000 persons, 99% of them men, and around 10% of them from Austria or from the Sudetenland. Until now, approximately half of these perpetrators have been identified by name. Due to the personnel files, there is some rough information on their biographies. Perpetrator research of German Täterforschung has been a focus, especially of German historians, during the last decades, and I took part in that. Fierce debates on the motivations of the killers were fought during the 1990s. I just addressed Daniel Goldhagen's spectacular book. Were they ideological soldiers? Were they ordinary men? Or were they ordinary Germans? Actually, it is quite difficult to reconstruct individual motivation in history in general. There are major methodological obstacles for research. Most of the documentations come from legal investigations and are highly flawed. For important perpetrators, first and foremost Hitler himself, documentation on his participation in the Holocaust is almost absent. It's very difficult to find out what Hitler did. That's one of the reasons is that he avoided paperwork. If we go down one level, Himmler completely documented, and we now can say what Himmler did every day. Next month, his service diary for the years 1943, 1945 will be published, but not for Hitler. I would argue that there was a core group of highly anti-Semitic men concentrated in the Nazi Party and in occupation administration, in SS and police. And some of these radicals were in other branches. This core group deliberately wanted to exterminate the Jews and took all organizational steps. One could call them even génocidaires, like Jacques Sénin, if there is such a type. The radicals in the institutions outside of SS and police were responsible for integration of all structures into the mass crimes, like military, economy department, health administration, even agriculture. All in all, this core group might add up to approximately 10%, maybe more, of all perpetrators. All others were integrated by organizational affiliation, as ordinary policemen, soldiers, and so on. For this integration, however, anti-Semitic cultures or discourses were decisive. Especially in occupied Eastern Europe, the murder of Jews was publicly endorsed. There was talk about all the time, both in public and in private conversation, which is also highly affirmative. Some men built their careers on mass murder. Many received medals like the Kriegsverdienstkreuz for killings. A large part of the personnel profited from robbing the Jews. And, as the eminent historian Raoul Hilberg put it, they all understood why it seemed to be necessary to murder each and every Jew. I think that's very important to see. Only in recent decades, the non-German perpetrators came into focus. The so-called collaborators. I forgot them here. Okay. On a regional and local level, the German occupiers were highly dependent on foreigners. Since they did not have the manpower, they did not have the local knowledge, and they even had difficulty to identify who is a Jew. The whole issue of collaboration is quite complex, not only out of moral reasons, but also as a historical phenomenon. There were collaborating states, like the Axis powers, especially in Eastern Europe, semi-autonomous systems like the Vichy governments or governments under German rule in other states, like in Greece, for example, or in Serbia, national, regional, and local administrations, local policemen, and members of other auxiliary services. And of course, there were individuals who denounced Jews or even killed them on their own. The frame of collaboration thus was quite diverse, very restricted in occupied Poland and the Soviet Union, rather autonomous in the other Axis states. And there was a considerable freedom of action even under occupation in Western and Northern Europe. Though anti-Semitism was widespread in Europe, and the anti-Semites came to the political forefront, their goal was not, or the goal of most of them was not mass extermination, but expulsion and exploitation. The Jews should go, their property should stay. And the participation in the Holocaust often was based on other political goals, a kind of deal-making, like gaining independence or acquiring territory, as in the case of Bulgaria. Research on collaboration, especially in Eastern Europe, is still in its infancy and not very welcome in these societies. And the results up to date present a rather depressing picture. The same applies more or less if we turn to the society inside Germany. The German society constantly changed in 1938 with the annexation of Austria and Western Bohemia, especially since 1941 with the large recruitment of men for the front, and finally with the influx of the forced laborers. If you went through Munich in 1944, 1945, approximately every fourth inhabitant was a French forced laborer or another one, which were not interned. German society was almost completely penetrated by Nazi culture, even in everyday life. And the majority of Germans were members either of Nazi organization or the military. They believed in the national community, the Volksgemeinschaft, which turned into a Kriegsgesellschaft, a war community, especially from 1941 on. Until about 1943, there was a broad consensus of belief in Hitler and in winning the war, which again affected the relationship towards the Holocaust. The most obvious involvement of the average Germans was the participation in robbing the Jews. Millions of Germans profited from expropriation and deportation of Jews by taking over property, by getting rid of competing Jewish enterprises, or by taking over positions which were previously held by Jews. There is a little study on a German village in Lower Saxony where you could see that nearly all of the population participated in the robbery. Each had a piece of Jewish furniture, whatever, clothing in his home, which is not probably representative, but shows how broad this was. A large part of German society, according to post-war polls, which were quite open, around 25% admitted that they knew in one way or the other about the killings in the East, though more on the mass executions and the ghettos than on extermination camps. And a lot of Germans from 1943 on feared retribution for the crime, especially after the beginning of Allied strategic bombing. Only a minority showed disgust about the mass murders in their diaries, correspondence, or private conversations. And even a smaller minority helped the persecuted Jews, especially those who had to go into hiding from 1942 on. And during the final period of the war, when open violence came to Germany proper, for example during the death marches, most Germans feared the prisoners and considered them as Bolsheviks, as Danny Blattmann has found out. The Jewish history of the Holocaust, on the contrary, only became the focus of Holocaust research at a very late point, with the exception, of course, of Israeli and some US American historians. The source basis for the Jewish history, especially for Eastern Europe, is much worse than that of the perpetrator side. So the use of survivor statements and interviews, until today we have between 150,000 and 180,000, is indispensable. As I mentioned before, for some smaller communities, there is no survivor and no documentation at all. And the research situation is quite uneven. To begin with the pre-war ramifications, the analysis of Jewish communities in Poland or in the Soviet Union, but also in Southeastern Europe before German occupations, only in the beginning. So we know few on the social resources, in the pre-war experiences, even the experiences of the anti-Jewish violence, which became crucial for the reactions during German occupation. The fate of the Jewish communities in Europe varied widely. Some faced 12 years of persecution, like in Germany, others only 2 weeks, like in the Ukrainian capital Kiev. Communication was decisive for the decision to escape. Only recently, the mass evacuation flight of Soviet Jews in the face of German occupation was investigated. Approximately 1.5 million Jews succeeded in escaping from the Germans in 1941. However, many of them died from malnutrition in the evacuation areas or in besieged Leningrad. On the other hand, the 3.3 million Jews who lived in Poland in 1939 found themselves in a trap. Only those who fled to the Soviet occupation zone and were later forcefully deported by the Soviets survived as a group. Nearly all others were unable to leave Poland or Eastern Poland in the summer of 1941, when this part of the country was overrun by German forces. But the research on ghettos has only recently gained momentum. The Jewish forced administrations, the so-called Judenräte, or different names in different countries, have been an old subject of controversy, not only due to the debate on Hannah Arendt's book. Some valuable older studies have now been augmented by newer research, which sheds, for example, a more differentiated light, for example, on the highly debated Lodz-Judenrat. A kind of counter-elite in the Polish ghettos, the Jewish social welfare, however, has not been researched at all. While the study of Jewish everyday life under persecution is still high on the agenda, some other issues remain rather unexplored. For example, the fate of Jewish women or Jewish children has been highlighted in many micro-studies, but no comprehensive approaches are available as far as I see. And unlike Jewish resistance, the investigation of intellectual Jewish perceptions of the Holocaust under occupation is still restricted to few communities, especially in Eastern Europe. When it came to mass murder in 1941, 1942, the strategies of survival became the most important feature of Jewish life, like hiding, acquiring false identities, and bribing authorities. Especially the issue of hiding has become a major subject of Holocaust historiography in Poland, with some unpleasant results in demolishing some national myths. Probably much less Jews were hidden by Poles, and much more Jews were killed by Poles than has been previously assumed. But the rate of death and survival was not so much dependent on the agency of the Jews themselves or the average Gentiles, but much more on German policies and structural factors. Countries with large Jewish communities like Poland, the Baltics, or the occupied Soviet Union suffered at the same time from long and extremely violent occupations, where the Germans created lawless spaces, and the Jewish minorities could not count on little support by societies or governments. More than 90% of the Jews who came under occupation in these countries were murdered. The cases of Yugoslavia, Greece, Czechoslovakia, and the Netherlands showed quite different political and structural patterns. Nevertheless, in each case, about 80% of the Jewish minorities did not survive. And the fate of the Jews in exile countries outside Germany was by and large decided by these countries themselves. Romania was, as I said, highly complicit in the Holocaust in Bessarabia and in Ukraine. Nevertheless, more than 95% of the Jews in the Old Kingdom, the core territory of Romania, survived, as opposed to Hungary, where the government stopped the cooperation in the Holocaust only at a very late point, after 440,000 Jews were deported. The Bulgarian leadership, on the other side, extradited all Jews in Bulgarian occupied territories and some Bulgarian Jewish citizens abroad, but was reluctant to deport the Jews from Bulgaria proper. All these different chances of survival are dependent on short-term political decisions, and the outcome might have been totally different. Thus, the role of the societies under occupation in the Holocaust was quite limited in the political arena, but very important for everyday life and for the survival of individual Jews. The study of European societies in the face of the Holocaust is probably the most important research perspective at this very moment. At the same time, it's highly complicated, not only dealing with very complex structures, but also with methodological problems and clouded by national myths. Research of the last 2 decades has shown how widespread anti-Semitism was in all European societies, maybe with some exceptions like Finland, Denmark, Italy, or Albania. Especially in those countries where the Jewish middle classes were considered by anti-Semites as an obstacle to their own nation building, anti-Semitism was high on the agenda. For example, among students or professional organizations. And fascism in East Central Europe was much more anti-Semitic than in Italy or in Western Europe. It were, however, less the fascists who cooperated in the Holocaust in occupied and Axis countries, but more conservative, ethno-nationalist, authoritarian regimes, which themselves even combated fascist movements, like in Romania or Hungary. Of course, the fascists remained active in the police and administrations, but only in few countries they took over power, like in Croatia in 1941 or in Norway in 1942. The fascist Arrow Cross government in Hungary, which came to power only very late in October 1944, terrorized the Jews in Budapest, but denied deportation to extermination camps. This was a Hungarian internal claim. Of course, there was a big East-West divide among European societies. Those in Western and Northern Europe had a tradition of democratic and civic culture and faced quite different occupations than the ones in Poland, the Soviet Union, or Yugoslavia. The only more or less independent societal forces under occupation were on the one side the underground movements and on the other side the churches. While the behavior of the underground movements vis-à-vis the Holocaust has been studied in detail with rather sobering results, there is very few research on the churches, especially in Eastern Europe, not the least since most of the files remain closed. So far, the record of the Catholic churches in the East is quite mixed, and among parts of the Orthodox Church even worse. For example, the Romanian Orthodox Church in Transnistria and occupied Ukraine fully supported the Holocaust. In general, the persecuted Jews had to fear their neighbors. Though the percentage of denouncers amongst society might have been marginal, their effect was horrific. And non-Germans could make profits from the Holocaust in large dimensions in the Axis countries, for example, the infamous Hungarian gold, on a low level in occupied countries. Regarding this new direction of research, which emphasizes the role of the local Gentiles in the Holocaust, it is, however, necessary to underline that the Germans ruled and that they set the frames for societies, that they corrupted and brutalized them. During the core phase of the Holocaust, a long period of German rule was still to be expected. Liberation seemed far away in summer and autumn 1942. On the other hand, individual examples of assistance and rescue now seem even more valuable than they were perceived before. Finally, a last word on one of the subjects we know probably most about, that's the international reactions on the Holocaust. The failure to solve the international refugee crisis in 1938-1939, the infamous conference of Evian-les-Bains, foreshadowed the international reaction to the Holocaust, but it was not responsible for the Holocaust. I think the problem lies more in the disinterest on the fate of the Jews during the early war period, until late 1941. There's almost no coverage on the ghettos in Poland, despite the fact that they were widely known. Over the course of 1942, however, the Allied and neutral governments became quite aware of what was going on in Europe, and they started public campaigning only in late 1942, when most of the Jews in occupied Poland and occupied Soviet Union were already dead, and when German troops ruled from the Atlantic to the Caucasus. Intervention was difficult, but it was possible, and to a certain extent effective, as the other Axis states are concerned. Romania stopped participating in mass murder in autumn 1942, not the least because of Allied pressure, as did Hungary in July 1944. The Allies even bombed Budapest, which was perceived by the Hungarian government as an indicator that this was for participation in the Holocaust. It is unclear why the Allies did not try to apply pressure on Bulgaria, which deported the Jews in the annexed territories at a very late stage, after it was clear that the Germans would lose the war after Stalingrad. Two cases remain under-researched: the role of the Soviet government and the Vatican in the face of the Holocaust. Stalin and his leadership apparently were not interested in stopping the Holocaust, at least they gave no orders to the partisan movement, for example, to do so. Instead, Stalin started to reduce the number of Jews in his own administrations from late 1942 on. And the Vatican's activity is subject to a constant debate, not the least because its files are closed until today, but now there's hope that next year the files will be open. To sum up, it is obvious that an enormous amount of documentation has been collected over the last 8 decades, and an enormous effort has been put into Holocaust research, especially during the last 30 years. Nevertheless, there are still serious obstacles to a comprehensive understanding of the Holocaust. Files and research are dispersed worldwide. Often more than 20 languages are necessary to do research on a European-wide basis. But there are also other problems, like the isolation of Holocaust studies from other related fields, like the research on the Second World War, on occupation history in general, and on the crimes against other groups than the Jews, who themselves probably made up little more than half of the victims of Nazism. Probably 11 million people died as victims of Nazism. And it is not clear in how much moral assumptions intervene in Holocaust research. For example, concerning the issue of comparison with other mass crimes or highly complicated cases like, for example, the Jewish ghetto police. In general, we now have a detailed picture of the cause of the Holocaust, maybe with some regional exceptions like Greece or the Russian Federations, where research is very weak. But lots of structural and analytical problems remain unsolved or heavily debated, like the origins of the Holocaust, the European-wide discourses on Jews, inadequate models how to interpret societal behavior, or just specific experiences of women and children during the Holocaust. Looking at the variety of micro-studies, it is often unclear in how much the events on the micro level are related to the overall picture, to this exceptional case of mass violence in history. But without this frame, it is difficult to establish the specificity of the Holocaust, which in itself is the basis for both Holocaust memory and Holocaust research. Historical Holocaust studies in the future will probably more and more focus on the behavior of groups and societies in the face of mass murder. I hope this will lead to a broader understanding of the emergence of mass violence, to its societal dynamics, but also to the international implications like conflict, expansion, war, and intervention. Then, Holocaust studies will not only be able to clarify more of our history, but it will also have a meaning in shaping our future. Thank you for your attention.